So Jen and I are contract research scientists for the Department of Defense. And in that role, we work on the olfactory sciences portfolio, meaning we do a lot of work in the realm of detection of various threats, whether they're chemical, biological, explosive, and then we also include some of the drugs into that, narcotics into that threat realm as well. So we've been doing that research for the past decade or so. And within that research portfolio, while we also do detection research on handhelds and instruments, we also have the military working dog as one of those detectors that we do comparisons with. And so we've learned a lot when we've had to compare and contrast the sensitivity and specificity of dogs with our traditional handheld detectors. And so that's sort of the background that we come at this from, just sort of viewing these dogs as another standoff detection modality. Jenna, did you want to add something?
No, I think that we're going to dive into a lot of what we are working on in the olfactory sciences group as we move through the slides.
Sweet. Yep. And I'll note that the title of Gambling with Your Training Aids is that basically if you're not following best practices, you are gambling with your training aids. And the tales from the dark side is that we've learned a lot of these lessons the hard way. And so we bring this knowledge forward and out to the canine community so that you all don't have to make the same mistakes that we have already. So I'll do a slide share here. All right. We will go over some definitions and standards just so we're all on the same page about the vocabulary that we're using. A short background on canine olfaction. Some of the equivalencies we draw as dogs as standoff detectors, and then talking about the life of a training aid in its basically in its two parts. So when we talk about odor definitions, we have three main definitions so far. The odorant, which is the molecule that gives off the odor, which is the analyte that we want to detect. So that analyte is typically detected by our instrumentation, and that is that odor molecule that will then bind to an olfactory receptor in the dog or the human nose. The odor profile, which is the collection of odorants that make up the unique odor of a target object. And then odor as a general term is that perception of the odor profile. And so when we say something like the odor of chocolate, that would comprise many, many odorants. So an example of a canine training aid, TNT, would be that the TNT would be the training aid or the bulk material, but the odorant that your dog is actually detecting is not the parent molecule of TNT. It's the odors that make it into the headspace, meaning the sort of gas cloud that's around the training aid. And so that is 2,4-dinitrotoluene, 2,4-DNT, not actually TNT. And so we have a collaborator who does some exquisite research on and headspace analysis on canine training aids, Dr. Lauren DeGrief, and she did a comparison of military-grade TNT and compared that to TNT vapor. And in the military-grade TNT, we found that it was 99.8% TNT and just a tiny bit of DNT and then some other components. But in the vapor, which again, that's what your dog's smelling, not the bulk material. It's the vapor that's getting drawn into your dog's olfactory system. It's 58% TNT, 35% DNT, and then 7% other compounds. And out of those three sort of components of TNT, DNT, and other components, that is going to vary. Those are going to have different vapor pressures and different volatilities. So the dog is not necessarily getting, that scent picture is very different for the dog than what your actual bulk training aid is. There are way more definitions and actually a lot of standards that are coming out. The previous standards were dictated by a scientific working group on dog and orthogonal detectors, and that was what we called SWIG-DOG. SWIG-DOG is somewhat no longer, but it's morphed into the NIST OSACs, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies Organizational Scientific Area Committees. That subgroup now informs what becomes the official standards board for the US, which is the ASB, the American Standards Board. And there's lots of definitions for the canine community that are out there. They do put out their documents for public comment. So if you do see people posting, hey, we need your comments or what have you, that's your opportunity to concur or to make some constructive criticisms if you don't agree with some of the definitions that are coming out there. So a bit about canine olfaction. We have a high-resolution photo here of Midtown Manhattan. This is Central Park. And so when we think about canine olfaction, the best way humans can really think about that is comparing it to our visual systems. So when we see this high-res picture of Central Park, we can see the exquisite resolution of Central Park and the high-rise buildings that surround it, the golf course, the baseball fields, the various bodies of water, etc. The only real negative of canine olfaction is that it's a closed system. And by that, we mean the dog isn't really telling us that it sees the golf course and the baseball fields and the bodies of water. And so there is a little bit of that communication barrier. There are some techniques that we have to try and understand what the dog is smelling, what the dog is then interpreting as that odor. And so one of those techniques is headspace, solid phase, micro extraction, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. That's that jumble of letters that you see at the top of the slide. That is an analytical chemistry technique that we use in the laboratory to identify all of the different odorants that are in the headspace, the odor of your training aids. Those techniques have some pros and cons as well. The cons are that it's lower resolution. It's typically non-quantitative, so we don't really know how many or how much odor there is of a certain odorant. And it's missing a lot of information because that technique relies on absorption onto a tiny fiber. And so not everything absorbs onto that fiber. So what that yields is a sort of it's missing a lot of resolution in that visual picture. So we can tell that there's a park in this, the middle of this city, maybe, if you kind of already know what you're looking at. But there's a lot of missing dots that are blocking out certain areas. And so when people say, oh, I've analyzed that training aid, or I've analyzed this, and this is what the dog smells or sees, we always want to caveat that with that's our best guess, or that's our best scientific method that compares to what the dogs could be smelling, because it's still not as sensitive as what the dogs are able to detect. So there's another technique called whole headspace detection, something real-time mass spectrometry. That's lower resolution, non-quantitative. You don't even get the VOC, the volatile organic compound identifications, but it's better for profile matching, so almost like a fingerprinting than the odorant identification. So this is really good if you're trying to match two odors together. And it doesn't rely on things absorbing too little fiber. But again, you're not really going to get any idea of what you're looking at. Why are dogs so good at what they do? As Jenna and I like to say, they were built for this. They have an olfactory epithelium that has this catacomb structure, if you see by the cross section there, that has these nasal passages that house millions of sensory receptors. They have an organ, the vomeral nasal organ, that humans don't even have. So they have an organ that we don't have. And that organ is specifically for olfaction. It's a sensory organ that can detect pheromones that are picked up by a dog's nose. So when they say that dogs can sort of smell each other's arousal states or their feelings or all these other things, they have an organ that's, again, specifically evolutionarily designed for that function. We don't even have it. Their nostrils, they have these slits in the side, so that the air that's exhaled doesn't dilute incoming air. It also allows them to detect or sense concentration gradients and follow odor to the greater concentration gradient. And so in an open area search, you'll see that as dogs go towards the area of odor, towards that concentration gradient. They have an olfactory bulb, a large part of their brain, 3 times larger than humans, is dedicated just to processing odor. So even more research has gone into canine olfaction when they've done some inhalational studies where they see that the surface area of the canine's olfactory organs is 32 times greater than a human's, way more olfactory receptor cells, and that density is greater. The respiratory pathway and the olfactory pathway are independent of each other. So that means they're able to exhale and also hold odor in sort of a recess of their olfactory pathway and process that odor at the same time. And then again, we talked about the external nares, the slits in the nose, being able to help localize source odor. In the olfactory process, we talk about odor source, sampling device, and interpretation. It breaks down into those 3 main components. The odor source can be anything. The sampling device is the nose, which is inhaling, respiring, and taking in that odor source or a sample of that odor source, which is in the form of a volatile organic compound. And then the interpretation, which is that cognition, the part of the brain that's interpreting that signal and making it into that smell that's experienced. Our sense of smell is very much a response to a change in environment. That phenomenon in canine is really what we call habituation, right? We get used to the odors that are around us, and that is when we sort of become nose blind to certain odors. When we think about dogs, we think about them as standoff detectors. A lot of the time we do that is because we have to defend why we still need military working dogs. Why do we still need bomb dogs? Why do we still need drug dogs when we have this new, whiz-bang detector or this new whiz-bang sensor or drone or AI technology or what have you? And so we get the question all the time, why dogs, or, why is this dog going to be any better than this new instrument? So we tell them the dog is already a standoff detector. It has all the components that it needs. The odor sources are the same. It has a sampling device, and the interpretation is actually more sophisticated, at least for now, than some of the computational systems that go into handheld detectors, because those are pre-programmed to only have a library that pings against whatever threats are out there, whereas dogs are able to generalize and not be so stuck on, oh, this is the one smell of C4, or this is the one smell of fentanyl. They're able to generalize beyond that and detect different variants of the target odor, whereas a lot of the handhelds or other instruments are not able to do that. But dogs are actually a better standoff detector than a lot of our instruments. So I won't click on this link now, but I think this presentation will be made available. If you click on that later, some of the scientists at NIST were able to 3D print a dog nose and put that on the front end of a handheld detector and then mimic the way dogs inhale and take in air. And so instead of this sample intake vacuum inlet where it just draws in continuous suction, the 3D printed dog nose was replicating how the dogs take in air in sort of this like whirlwind manner. And that was able to increase the sensitivity of those handheld detectors tenfold. So we get into the life of a training aid, part 1. So this is what happens before it even gets to you. And this is not something you have a whole lot of control over. And what do we know about this process? Not a whole lot. So this would cover the synthesis method and the manufacturing of your training aid. A little bit of a black box then happens where you don't know the age or the storage of the packaging of how the training aid has been taken care of by that manufacturer. And then oftentimes there's delivery to a customer that's not you. So in a lot of the canine industry, you're not the primary customer. That's going to someone else. And then what in the narcotics, that tends to be true as well. You're getting them from DEA, and they're not synthesizing that or making that for you. So you're an intermediary. Jenna, you want to take over from here?
Sure. So as Michelle explained, we are not the primary customers for explosive training aids. They are targeting a completely different community, which would be the EOD community, in that they just want to make sure that those training aids go boom. So where do we as a canine community have issues with this? Well, for one, what is the complete composition of that explosive? So as Michelle had explained, it has to go through its synthesis and its manufacturing to start. Well, we don't even know what chemicals are being put together, for lack of better terms, at that synthesis stage. And what is the cast that's being used to form these explosives? What are the different packaging materials that they're using that all composes of that training aid? And as such, that composes the odor that's coming off of that training aid. So black box, as Michelle was explaining, that's how long was it sitting in someone's hands before it was actually packaged or before it was actually cut into smaller pieces? Maybe it went from manufacturer to a distributor to now a smaller mom and pop to now your training aid director for your area to now your canine supervisor. Well, that just changed a whole lot of hands, a whole lot of storage, and a whole lot of different odors that just got put onto your training aid. Faulty material. Again, we're not the primary customer, so we don't know if there's a taggant in there from the previous explosive that was sitting in the cast. We don't know if there's some sort of a different chemical maybe that they were using to color it or to help preserve it. Again, that's going to impact what the dog is smelling that is coming off of that training aid. SDSs, safety data sheets. So these are really important and really awesome until you start to look at the percentages. So as a canine handler or trainer, you look at double base smokeless powder and you want to start training on it. Well, you want to know what is the composition of that double base smokeless powder, and you start to go through the different names of the components as well as the weights. So if you start with nitrocellulose, okay, great. Well, 50 to 100% weight, so it could be 50 to 100%. That is a very, are you changing gears on me already?
No, this is what talks about it.
Roger. So you could have 100% cellulose on your quote unquote double base smokeless powder, which, fun fact, is no longer double base smokeless powder. That is now single base smokeless powder.
No, wait, so other way around. So if it's
yeah.
100% nitrocellulose, then it's the single base smokeless powder. But based on that SDS, it could be 50% nitrocellulose and 42% nitroglycerin, which would make it a double base smokeless powder.
Correct.
Right.
So not only are we looking at nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin as sitting within our double base smokeless powder, but here are all the other components that could be, based on that SDS, the percentage, that could be sitting in that training aid that you are about to train your dog on. So how do you know you're not training on potassium nitrate, potassium sulfate? How do you know that you don't have, indeed, 100% nitrocellulose? Unless you have a laboratory, you don't know. Next slide. So how do you determine what the right training aid is? Well, for one, you got to look at your threat list. What are you wanting to detect, and what is your adversary using? We always say, well, Michelle and I like to say, what are the Terrys doing? But everything is going to be different based on your mission space. So drugs, what's relevant on the street is not necessarily going to be what's relevant for the border folks. Explosives, the explosives that we're seeing CONUS currently are not necessarily the same explosives that we're seeing OCONUS. And not to mention, we have different manufacturers all over the world with different ways of manufacturing, different ways of storing, and you can see what I'm getting at. That again goes back to the primary customer versus secondary customer. Those explosives manufacturers don't care about the canine community. They just want to develop something that goes boom. So we can roll back through. Are we reassessing our training aids? Are we reassessing the list based on what we're seeing in our threats? And I mean, I know military working dogs, they have not looked at their training aid list since 1972. If my history serves me correct, our threat list has changed drastically since 1972, especially with the high ramp of homemade explosives. That gets into our novel and emerging threats. So we have a lot of explosives right now coming out of China. We don't know what the hazard classes are, what the toxicology is. Is there going to be something that's going to be an issue for the human aspect? We know that C4 is horrible for a dog if he eats it. We try not to let him eat it, but we don't necessarily know if an odor of an explosive training aid is going to be an inhalation issue for the handler. So these are things that we really have to pay attention to. And that falls into also inhalation issue for your dog. Are you willing to take a training aid that you know nothing about to train your dog on and potentially to turn him into an adenosmic sensor? So a dog that can't smell anymore. You want to take this one, Michelle?
Yeah, so again, our collaborator, Dr. Lauren DeGrief, did some really elegant work with HMTD, where she looked at all of the variation with time, environment, and formulation. And when we have theoretically on the threat list and relevant to our area of operations, an HMTD training aid that's on our training aid list, let's say we've established, yes, we need to train on HMTD. Well, okay. What time frame of HMTD? Because if you look, HMTD is sort of constantly evolving, and in the first 16 weeks of an HMTD training aid, it has a very different odor profile than in the last 16 weeks of its odor profile. And so those are some of the considerations we need to have. Maybe we need to train on both of them. And then the quality. Oftentimes we'll say that, oh, we don't really need to train on high grade stuff because the bad guys don't have access to all of these lab grade materials, or they're not going to purify their stuff. Well, we don't really want to ever underestimate the adversary. Sometimes we find threat material that is really high grade. And so there's some scenarios where you'd want to train on lab grade and not lab grade material. And then the environmental conditions. Some training aids are very much affected by temperature and humidity. And we also know that training aids get cross-contaminated. And so this is a study that was done by MIT Lincoln Labs back in 2017. They had these energetics that were expected in these training aids. So they had, if you, like, for example, on the first line, if you have ammonium nitrate, you would expect, or sorry, ammonium dynamite, you would expect to find nitroglycerin there. And then they did not find any contaminant energetics there. But from what we know about nitroglycerin, it tends to contaminate lots of things. So when they looked at the training aid for C4, they expected to find RDX, but what they were really finding on the C4 was PETN and nitroglycerin contaminants. And so this is what happens when we don't use best practices in terms of keeping our training aids separated, and when we let our training aids, quote unquote, talk to each other. So the life of a training aid, part 2. What do we know about this process? Well, actually, we know a lot, and this is in our control. And so this is where we can sort of have our interventions, our best practices to ensure that we have the odors that have the best integrity and maintain that integrity, and also decrease the opportunities for contamination. So when we talk about assembling our kits, we want to have different levels of containment. Some people call it like the Russian doll assembly, or primary, secondary, tertiary containment. And essentially what that is what in primary containment is what is directly containing or surrounding your training aid. And typically what you would find is the cotton scent bag or the metal sniffer tin. There's also some of the plastic flip top canisters. And then on the newer end, what we've developed at K9, which is the training aid delivery device, or the TAD. And secondary containment, people will often use metallized mylar bags or jars. You can use glass jars with Teflon lids. And then tertiary containment, oftentimes we'll use Pelican cases with airtight seals, and people will use Tupperware as well. So this is a quick introduction to the TAD. This is what we're moving a lot of our training aids over to because it provides levels of training aid containment that are superior to the aforementioned ones for primary containment. So it basically is a glass jar that has a gasket, a filter membrane, and then a membrane holder to protect that membrane, and a lid. And once that TAD is assembled, it has hermetic seals, meaning that it's gas tight. And so you can then protect the integrity of your training aid, and also use that device for storage and training. So why do we use the TADs for containment? Well, the TAD is primary containment, so we can use it to store and train with hazardous material. There's not an opportunity for dogs to inhale any particulate. So we had some videos that we made where we used a cotton scent bag and we labeled it with, or put some fluorescent powder into it, and we put it on the surface of a table, and then we just picked it up, and there was just, the whole table was contaminated with fluorescent powder. And so every time you're training, you're basically leaving behind trace residue and particulate of your training aid. So that leaves loss, right? That means you're losing your training aid. It means that you're contaminating your hide and training locations. It also means that the people that train there the next time, you're making it almost impossible for them, because oftentimes dogs will alert in that area where someone trained previously. And if you didn't know that that's where they place their hide, you're very likely to pull the dog off of trace odor. So instead of, what you should be doing is rewarding the dog, and instead you're pulling the dog off of odor. and that's not what we want to be doing. So there's the TADs will also protect your training environment from that contamination. And the TAD is also something that you can put liquid or gel training aids into, due to the water repelling or hydrophobic nature of the filter membrane. So how that compares to current technology is that compared to a cotton scent bag, a plastic film canister, or a metal sniffer tin, you can turn on and off odor, basically because when you put the cap on and you have those gaskets, you can make sure that any off-gassing out of the TAD no longer occurs. You can use it with liquids, hazmat, and fine powders and still have it contained. Not having your training aid continually off-gas means that you can also extend your training aid shelf life and service life. You're protecting your hide sites from contamination. And what's really neat is that you can decontaminate the outside of the TAD. So if you bury it, or if you get the TAD full of slobber or kibble or whatever you all do with it, at the end of a training day, you can completely wash it, clean it, submerge it underwater, and do whatever you need to do to get it clean and start fresh the next day. We also developed the TAD to have negligible background odor. So all of the materials that comprise the TAD meet the NASA outgassing database's criteria for being low outgassing, meaning very, very low VOC, because we didn't want any of the components of the TAD to compete with the odor of your training aid. And it also protects the K9 and the handler from the training aid. So the nice aspect of that is that you can securely or sort of safely train on some hazardous material and feel more confident that you and your dog are safe while doing so. So when we're have these considerations for kit assembly, we really do want to take into account packaging. You don't want to spend a lot of time or money getting these training aids and then only to put them in a Ziploc bag, or only to put them in a cotton scent bag, to be frank. So some of the criteria that you want to look for in packaging or in your secondary or tertiary containment are things like MVTR, OTR. These are terms that are not going to be easy to find, but they will be researchable or something that you can find in good containment systems. And so that's the moisture vapor transmission rate, which would determine if something's watertight. And the OTR is the oxygen transmission rate, which would determine if something's airtight. Other considerations you want to have are the seal, the odor of the packaging and containment. So something could have a really good MVTR and OTR, but have also a really large amount of odor that you don't want being surrounded by your training aid. Cost is obviously one of them, and then compatibility with your training aids. Some of these packagings may not be compatible with your training aids. So it is kind of a complex bit of research to do to figure out how to assemble your kit properly. So this is a quote from one of my favorite people. So only inorganic materials can contain organic materials. So there are some new barriers that have that are sort of plastic based, that are getting better at mimicking sort of the steel, aluminum, and glass that are in the bottom there, the bottom left portion of the chart, where you have your water permeation rate and oxygen permeation rate. So in the bottom left, that would be the gold standard. That would be the best of the best with the lowest amount of potential water permeation and the lowest amount of potential oxygen permeation. If you see in the next, so most of our training aids are organic, but if you see in this next slide, packaging comparisons and trade-offs, a lot of these plastics that people are putting their training aids in, like the nylon arson bags or the Ziploc bags or OPSAC bags, are actually not great for their various properties of oxygen transmission rate or water vapor transmission rate. So there are a lot of trade-offs there. So if you're using those bags, you can do better. So we have made some recommendations. We've been seeing recently not so great results with some of the OPSAC bags, so we've actually stopped recommending those, but we are seeing very good success with the metallized Mylar bags. And so you can get those, source those from Uline. We've had not so good success sourcing those from Amazon just because they've been, you don't actually know what you're getting, but the Uline, you can see that they have this layer called VMPET, and that's that is the molecule, or that's the chemical that you want that indicates that it's has that metallized layer in between the plastics that make it odor barrier. So in our arrangement of odors, we want to make sure that there is physical segregation, and we pay careful attention to the co-location of odors. We want to really be careful about our high vapor pressure odors in terms of those are the most likely to contaminate all of your other training aids. And we only want to have one training aid or one odor open at a time. And so that's where our opportunities for cross-contamination really exist. So these are the kind of charts that you want to have handy so that you know which one of your training aids have high vapor pressures and are likely to contaminate your other training aids. But these are the vapor pressures of some of the common explosives that you will have in your training aid kits. And you can see DMNB and nitroglycerin, the TAG and nitroglycerin was that contaminant that was in the MIT Lincoln Labs chart. Those are common ones to find as contaminants in training aid kits when they're inspected. Or analyzed rather. So in storage conditions, some of the things we're learning, again, the hard way, is that storage conditions for explosive training aids, and I'm sure narcotic training aids too, they have tended to focus on the physical security and not the odor integrity at all, right? So they're made by companies like RMAG, or I don't know who makes the other safes, but they're really trying to focus on like, don't steal the explosives and don't steal our drugs. And those are great priorities to have, but that doesn't take into consideration what we need to do for maintaining the integrity of our training aids. So we've been in bunkers where all of the canisters are just baking in the sun. It's 150 degrees inside the in the bunker, and all of the training aids are just heated up and cross-contaminating each other. So that's not a great situation for any of the training aids to be in. It's really a perfect scenario for just contamination. So we have odor assessments that we do. Even when we will label our training aids, we won't use Sharpies because we know that Sharpie odor easily contaminates the training aids. And then when we do odor recognition tests and we put Sharpies out as a distractor, dogs will often hit on it. We did a study where we had two samples. One sample was walked across the street, and another sample was driven to a lab on base because it was too far away to walk to. And in the headspace analysis, the one that was driven had octane contamination in it. And that was because it was driven, right? There's gas contamination from the fuel of the car that was driven. So some of our instruments are really sensitive, and then the dog's even more sensitive. So if you can drive yourself crazy with some of this, but we do want to take that into consideration when we start looking at if you can develop your training aid storage and containment systems from the ground up, or if you're getting new training aids, how you can take care of them better. So this is a photo of that nested or Russian doll training aid containment system by Ken Furton when he was doing some presentations for Swig Dog, but this was at the Penn Vet conference a while back. So basically it's showing primary containment. So the 3 odors in the box of 4 there are 3 odors of the same training aid in a small pelican case. And then that small pelican case is nested into a larger pelican case. And that's typically what we have been recommending. The large pelican case is just for transport. And the smaller pelican case is that secondary containment. And those glass jars are primary containment. The other training aid kit on the right is a little bit more of a gamble, just because all of your training aids of differing composition are close to each other. But it can be done if those are all double, triple contained. So in our handling of training aids, we want to be using gloves, glove changes. We often have a clean person or a designated clean person and dirty person. That makes sure that we aren't sort of losing track of who's contaminated with target odor versus who's placing the blanks or the distractors in the training environment. It's not enough to, in the operational environment, when you're doing operational searches, to just plant the training aid and say, oh, well, the training environment has tons of distractors anyway. It's not enough. Dogs will follow your pattern of disturbance in the grass or in the fields, or they'll follow your skin rafts through the woods. So you have to be placing other distractors or blanks in the operational environment as well. We have a pretty strict order of placement of blanks, controls, distractors, then targets. That also helps prevent a lot of potential mix-ups and contamination issues. And we pay a lot of attention to what comes in contact with our training aids, because we want to know if that's something that's acceptable or something that we now have permanently contaminated our training aid and we need to toss it. So there's all sorts of different types of gloves. Some are better than others. We also realize that there's a PPE shortage in the country, and these were all prices pre-COVID. So good luck finding nitrile gloves for that price now. The HDP gloves have the least amount of odor resistance. You can use those if you're having very brief interaction with any of your training aids. Vinyl gloves offer medium odor resistance. This is not quantitative in any way. And then the nitrile gloves offer the most odor resistance. Shelf life and service life. We define these differently, but they're also defined differently depending on what industry you're in. So we have some questions about when our training aids expire. It's really a different answer based on each training aid and based on the storage conditions. So when we define expire, the explosives industry would say, well, if it still goes boom, it's still good. And in the canine industry, we're saying, well, does it still smell like the original target, or does it still smell like something that's operationally relevant? So the service life is probably much shorter than we realize. But we also have to take into account, if it still goes boom, the adversary will still use it. And so that's why we have different odors for different purposes. We have odors that are for training, for certifying, and for calibrating your canine, or for imprinting or odor recognition tests. So that leads into this concept of clean kit, dirty kit. Jenna, can you describe this one?
Sure. So like we like to point out to a lot of our military working dog teams is when you initially get your explosives from your ammo guys, even though we do already assume that they are dirty, since we are, again, that secondary customer, we will, for all intents and purposes, call it the clean kit. So that is the kit that you want to be imprinting your dogs on. You want to be taking great care in it, wearing gloves. You will only be using it in those imprinting situations. So you will not be putting it in operational spaces. The storage of these odors should be, there should be a lot of care put into them, as Michele had noted, a couple different instances of layers, that nested approach. So that would be the probably first 2 to 3 months of the lifespan of that kit. Then that kit gets moved into what we would call the current kit. So that's going to be the kit that's used maybe in your box room just to get your dogs a few reps, not necessarily for imprinting anymore. Once you've used that for another 1 to 2 months, then we call that now the dirty kit. It's been handled multiple times. It's been sniffed by multiple dogs. It's for all thoughts, it's now dirty. So we can now start putting it out into our operational spaces and understand that when we put it in a drawer and we assume that the drawer was clean, it's probably going to start picking up some residue, whether it be the smell of someone's Sharpie or the smell of their lunch from the day before. It is now one with that training aid. So once that dirty kit has been used in the operational space for, we'll say, another 1 to 2 months, it should now be demoed and not be used in canine training anymore, because we do not assume that it smells like that explosive from that clean/current kit anymore.
Jenna?
So big takeaways or principles, as we'd say, question everything. So we get a lot of information from manufacturers. My product is the best, or my product has been used this many times, or Navy SEALs have been using this for years, what have you. That all sounds great, but without the data behind it, we really can't trust it. So where are those training aids coming from? What is actually being put into that manufacturing process? When were they manufactured? I can name one time most recently, Michele and I were involved in a project where they had asked us if we would be able to train dogs on a certain threat. And we were being told that we were going to be tested on an extremely pure threat. And come to find out, after we finished the project and we saw the threat come in, tested all the dogs, and we analyzed the, the containment of the threat. That threat was actually produced in 2011, and we were testing in 2019. So not only was it super old, it probably was not pure, because it was sitting in some bunker somewhere next to who knows what. So again, how have they been stored? When were they manufactured? A lot of times we have no idea, or we'll be told something that is completely off base. Preserving the odor integrity, this is huge. Limiting the cross-contamination is a big deal. We go through a lot of gloves. We recommend that you too start to go through a lot of gloves. Good, better, best storage. Our good friend JJ at the ATF, this is his quip. So if you can't be purchasing that best container, how can you be best containing it otherwise? So can you be now nesting it, or maybe you can find a couple different containers for a couple different odors. Too many times I see folks roll up and here are all my odors, and they're all sitting in a cute little ammo can. Well, guess what? All those odors only smell like one thing. Blind training, this is huge for us. Not having the same person continually put your odors out and continually grade your dogs. Cannot say it more times. Find other folks that can come in and help you set up your scenarios, help you set up that matrix. Just recently, someone told us, well, we only test our dogs with a group of 5 or a lineup of 5, and we will never put an odor in the first box or in the last box. Why? Makes no sense. So that just kind of goes into, well, when someone new comes in and does a blind training for that group, I sure as hell hope they put an odor in the first box or the last box. Scientifically valid certifications. We come up against this a lot for us, and making sure that you have the stats that tell you how to put your odors out, and not just your targets. That's your controls, your empties, and your distractors. We see a lot of times where folks will say, oh yeah, I put the odor out 10 times and he found it all 10 times. Well, that's great. But the first time that he found that odor is actually weighted differently than the 10th time he found that odor. Because guess what? He learned it every time you paid him. So that statistical variance should be taken into account. Varied training, I'm sure a lot of you already do this. The location, the types of training aids, if you can use other folks' training aids, high and low vapor pressure odors, as Michele showed the chart. Stress is a big thing. You're going to probably train a little differently if you have a stress vest on. So we use that in the Department of Defense. The vest will actually, it's almost like an e-collar for a human. And so if you accidentally go through a door and don't check behind it, boom, you get hit with a jolt. Or if your dog does not find an odor and you walk right past it, boom, you get hit with a jolt. That's a lot of stress to be put onto a handler who's typically used to just having a nice walk in the park behind the leash. So how can you add to these situations? I know folks will add smoke and sprinklers and lights and what have you. Not only is that stress for the dog, but that's also good stress to be putting a handler through in training. I already touched on this, but show me the data. We see it a lot. Just, oh yeah, we've tested this many a time and the results are, 99 to 100%. Well, can I see the data? No, it's classified. Well, fun fact, companies cannot classify their data. So if they're not giving it to you, there's a reason why they're not giving it to you. Only the government can classify data. And it takes a village. I want to thank Ryan and his group for having us on here. We love to see there start to be more interaction between the scientific community and the operational community, because we understand that we don't always necessarily speak the language, and that causes a huge divide. And I just want to put out that Michele and I are always happy to answer questions. If we don't have the answer, then we will run it to ground and find someone who will have the answer for you. As Michele had pointed out, we've had a lot of ups and downs and learned a lot of hard lessons, and we are more than happy to share those hard lessons and also those successes to help you increase or enhance your K9 team capability. And unless you are super sick of us, you can always contact us at contact@sci-k9.com. And if other folks know us on our .mil emails, you can contact us there as well.